the wind howling through the Bavarian Alps in October of 1945 carried with it the bitter chill of an approaching winter. But inside the stone walls of the Garmisch orphanage, the cold was something far deeper. The building, a former convent, now held 43 children who had lost absolutely everything. They had lost their homes, their parents, their childhoods, and in many ways their ability to hope. Standing in the drafty entrance hall was a 32-year-old American soldier named Sergeant Michael Chun. In his hand, he held a stack of adoption papers. His eyes, however, were fixed on a tiny, fragile 7-year-old boy named Klaus, who simply refused to look up from the floor. The boy had just been told that an American soldier, a man from the very army he had been conditioned to view as the ultimate enemy, wanted to take him across the ocean and raise him as his own son. Klaus shook his head, terrified. He was absolutely certain this was a trick. What happened next would go on to completely redefine what the word family meant, defying logic, defying borders, and defying the fresh hatred of the deadliest war in human history. Sergeant Michael Chun was not your typical American soldier. He was a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco. His parents had immigrated to California in 1910, painstakingly building a small grocery business in the heart of Chinatown. They raised 3 sons who grew up as fiercely proud Americans, despite the heavy shadow of discrimination that followed them everywhere they went. When the war broke out, Michael enlisted in 1942. Initially, the Army assigned him to administrative work, governed by a quiet, prejudiced belief that Asian faces shouldn't be in combat roles. But Michael's sharp mind and linguistic abilities, fluency in English, Cantonese, and a rapidly developing command of German made him incredibly valuable to the Army's Civil Affairs Division. By late 1945, he found himself stationed in the ruins of Bavaria, part of the American military government tasked with managing the absolute chaos of post-war Germany. His daily life was a grueling routine of restoring basic services, managing displaced refugees, and trying to pull a functional society out of the ashes of the Third Reich. He was practical and highly capable. Everywhere he looked, he saw the true cost of war, measured not in ruined buildings, but in shattered lives. The orphan crisis was the most agonizing part of it all. Millions of children were left completely alone. Orphanages were critically overwhelmed and dangerously undersupplied. As winter closed in, the children lived in conditions that would shock even the most hardened combat veterans. Crowded rooms, minimal heating, and barely enough food to survive. As part of his duties, Michael visited these orphanages to coordinate supply shipments. And it was during his 3rd visit to the Garmisch orphanage in September that a specific child caught his attention, Klaus Richter. 7 years old, impossibly small for his age, with dark hair and hollow eyes that looked far too old for his face. Klaus sat completely alone during meals. He ate mechanically. He didn't play. He didn't cry. He simply existed. The senior caretaker, Sister Marguerite, noticed the sergeant watching the boy. She told Michael that Klaus had been found months earlier in the smoking ruins of Munich, hiding in a dark cellar. His parents were believed to have perished in the final, catastrophic bombing raids. She warned Michael that Klaus was severely damaged. He trusted no one. He startled at the slightest noise. Whatever horrors he had witnessed in the dark before being rescued had marked his soul deeply. But Michael couldn't get the boy out of his head. There was something about Klaus's absolute isolation that resonated with Michael in a profoundly personal way. Michael found himself returning to the orphanage more and more, long after his official duties were finished. He just wanted to observe Klaus, to understand him. Klaus, meanwhile, was a boy whose timeline had violently snapped. He had been 7 for 3 months when his entire world ended. His memories before the bombs were just fragmented, ghostly echoes. A mother singing while cooking, an apartment with a view of church spires, a father going to work. And finally, the morning his mother simply didn't wake up after a close hit. She looked peaceful, like she was sleeping, but she was gone. His father became a ghost after that, eventually leaving the crumbling apartment one morning to find food and never coming back. Klaus had waited for 3 agonizing days in the dark, with no food, no water, and no hope. He eventually crept into a cellar, surviving on rainwater and scraps for weeks, perhaps months, until American soldiers pulled him from the rubble. Now at the orphanage, he had shut down his internal world completely. It was the only way his mind could protect itself from any more pain. But then, this American sergeant started showing up. The man with the kind face who didn't look like the other soldiers. He brought chocolate, but he didn't force Klaus to talk. He just sat nearby. Michael had made a decision that defied all logic. He was going to adopt this broken German boy. He was single, living in military quarters, and had 0 experience raising a child. He was due to deploy back to the United States soon. By every metric, it was an insane idea. But Michael had grown up feeling like an outsider in his own country. He knew what it felt like to be looked at and judged by surface markers. When he looked at Klaus, sitting alone in the corner of that cold room, he saw himself. He saw a human being who desperately needed someone to deliberately choose him. The logistics of adopting a German orphan as a single Chinese-American soldier were a nightmare. When Michael formally requested permission, Sister Marguerite was deeply skeptical. She warned him of the boy's night terrors and his deeply ingrained fear of Americans. She pointed out the massive cultural divide. But Michael calmly responded that he had lived his entire life navigating cultural divides. He told her that maybe that was exactly what Klaus needed, someone who understood what it meant to be caught between worlds. His commanding officer, Colonel Hartford, was equally bewildered. He pointed out the sheer madness of the plan, but Hartford also knew Michael's character. He signed the papers, warning Michael that this would be the hardest thing he would ever do. Michael knew he couldn't just announce his plans to the boy. He had to build a bridge of trust, inch by painstaking inch. He spent weeks just occupying the same space as Klaus, leaving a piece of chocolate on a table, leaving a wooden toy car nearby, speaking quietly to the caretakers so Klaus could get used to the sound of his voice. Eventually, Michael sat next to Klaus at dinner. He didn't force a conversation, he just sat there. And Klaus didn't run away. In November, Michael brought a translator to a small private room to finally explain his intentions. Klaus looked terrified, expecting punishment. Through the translator, Michael explained that he was returning to California, a safe place near the ocean, and he wanted Klaus to come with him. Not as a charity case, but as his actual son. Klaus's eyes widened in sheer panic. He shook his head violently. He whispered his first words to Michael, begging not to go, reminding him that Americans were the enemy. Michael didn't push. He simply said that the war was over, that people could choose to care about each other, and that he would be back tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. For weeks, Klaus wrestled with the impossible weight of this choice. He stood by the frost-covered windows, staring out into the Bavarian snow. He asked the older orphans for advice. He asked Sister Marguerite how he could possibly know if this man was telling the truth. She gave him the wisdom that would change his life. She told him to ignore words and watch actions. This man had shown up every single day. He made no demands. He only offered patience. She told Klaus that staying in the orphanage guaranteed a bleak, lonely future, and that sometimes a person must choose the terrifying unknown over a reality that offers absolutely no hope. On November 28th, Klaus walked up to Michael and spoke clearly. "I will go with you to America if you still want me." Michael knelt down to the boy's eye level and promised him that families could still exist, even after everything had been destroyed. Klaus asked what he should call him. Michael said he didn't want to replace the parents who had loved him, but for now, Michael was fine, or Dad, whenever he was ready. The departure was deeply emotional. Klaus left behind the only fragile stability he had known since the bombs fell. As the train carried them from Garmisch to Paris, Klaus watched the scarred, ruined landscape of his homeland roll by. He told Michael that everything was broken. Michael gently replied that broken things can be rebuilt, and that Klaus himself was living proof of that resilience. In Paris, the reality began to set in. Michael showed him a city recovering from the darkness. They stood beneath the Eiffel Tower. Klaus asked if people in America would hate him for being German. Michael was honest. He said some might, because of the war, but that his family would only see him as a son. The 12-day ship journey across the Atlantic cemented their bond. Klaus practiced English phrases. When a passenger asked Michael about the boy, assuming he was a charity project, Michael firmly corrected her. "He's not a responsibility, he's my son." Klaus overheard this, and a profound shift happened within his heart. The details of how they came together mattered less than the absolute reality of Michael's fierce protection. In January 1946, Klaus arrived in a foggy, bustling San Francisco. Stepping off the ship into Chinatown, he was overwhelmed by foreign faces and languages until Michael's mother, Lily Chun, welcomed him with a gentle touch and life-changing words. "You are family now." Above the family's grocery store, Klaus found a room prepared just for him, the first he had ever owned. Despite the strange city sounds, the lingering fear of war began to fade. He was no longer an abandoned orphan of rubble. He was fed, safe, and finally, someone's son. But the real world is never a simple fairy tale. The adjustment was brutal. School was a battlefield. Klaus was a German boy with a heavy accent in a predominantly Chinese-American school, in a country fresh out of a war against his homeland. The other children were cruel. They called him a Nazi. They pushed him. Klaus fought back with the fury of a boy who had survived the apocalypse. The principal called Michael in, demanding Klaus control his temper. That night, Michael sat down with Klaus. The boy was in tears, angry at the world, asking why they hated him. Michael told him something that would become the foundation of his life. He said that fighting wouldn't change their minds. The only way to win was to show them exactly who he was. To be kind when they were cruel. To prove that people are individuals, not the stereotypes of their nations. It was an agonizingly hard lesson for a traumatized boy, but Michael reminded him that he had survived things that would break grown men. He could survive the cruelty of the schoolyard. Slowly, the ice thawed. Klaus's English improved. He made a friend named Tommy Lee, another boy who understood the strange feeling of living between two cultures. The grocery store became Klaus's ultimate classroom. He worked alongside the family, interacting with immigrants from every corner of the earth. Chinatown, a place built by outsiders, naturally wrapped its arms around this strange, displaced German boy. But the most beautiful bond was formed in the kitchen. Lily Chun didn't speak German, and Klaus didn't speak Cantonese, but they found a shared dialect in food. She taught him to fold dumplings. He tried to replicate his mother's German recipes with whatever ingredients they had. They created fusion dishes that belonged to neither culture, but wholly to their new family. By the summer of 1946, the frozen boy from the Bavarian cellar was gone. Klaus was laughing. He was playing. He was healing. One evening in July, Klaus and Michael sat on the roof of their building, watching the sunset paint the San Francisco Bay in strokes of gold and crimson. Klaus turned to Michael and finally asked the question that had been burning in his chest for a year. "Why did you really choose me?" Michael looked at the city lights and answered honestly. He said he saw a boy who had completely given up on the idea that connection was possible. He wanted to prove to Klaus that he wasn't alone, that love could survive the end of the world. Klaus looked down and quietly admitted that it had worked. He still missed his parents. He still had nightmares about Munich, but he felt like he belonged here. He asked if it was okay to feel both things. Michael assured him it was necessary. He told him he was Klaus Richter from Munich and Klaus Chun from San Francisco, and he never had to choose between the two. The silence hung between them, thick with emotion, until Klaus looked up. "Can I call you Dad?" he asked. Michael's throat tightened as he nodded. "Okay, Dad," Klaus replied. In that single breathtaking moment, a German orphan and a Chinese-American soldier defied the darkest chapters of human history to forge an unbreakable bond. The boy who lost everything grew up to have it all. Klaus Chun graduated from high school, went to UC Berkeley, and became a brilliant engineer. He married a woman from an Irish immigrant family, had 3 children, and built a life in the American suburbs that would have been entirely unimaginable to the starving child in the cellar. In 1965, he traveled back to Munich. He stood in the modern rebuilt streets, searching for the ghost of his childhood apartment. The rubble was gone. The city had been reborn, just as he had. He managed to track down Heinrich, his old friend from the orphanage. Over coffee, the 2 men, former lost boys, reflected on their fates. Heinrich remarked that Klaus had gotten out. Klaus smiled and said he hadn't just gotten out, he had been saved. He had learned that identity isn't a singular rigid thing. We contain multitudes. Michael Chun retired as a lieutenant colonel and spent the rest of his life helping other soldiers navigate the chaotic process of military adoptions. In 1972, he stood before a massive crowd at a veterans conference. Klaus sat in the front row, a 40-year-old father himself, listening to the man who saved him. Michael told the crowd about the people who had called him crazy in 1945. They had warned him about the cultural divide, the trauma, the sheer impossibility of it all. But they were wrong, Michael boomed from the podium. Not because it was easy, but because family isn't about similarity, it's about commitment. It's about choosing to love someone and then doing the relentless work that choice requires. He pointed directly at Klaus. He told the world that his son was whole and happy, not by accident, but because they had both simply chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of war. Klaus Chun passed away in 2015 at the age of 77. At his funeral, his 3 children stood before a diverse crowd and spoke of a grandfather who taught them that love is an act of choice, that belonging comes from compassion, not bloodlines. Later, while sorting through his belongings, they found a wooden box. Inside were the yellowed adoption papers, a photograph of a terrified 7-year-old boy in Bavaria, and a picture of Michael holding his first grandchild. At the very bottom, wrapped carefully in cloth, was a letter addressed to his children. Klaus had written it years prior, knowing this day would come. The letter didn't speak of his career or his wealth. It spoke of a 32-year-old soldier in an orphanage who didn't have to look twice at a broken boy, but did. It read, "He saved me spiritually. He gave me proof that connection was still possible, even when the world had been destroyed. You carry 2 legacies. The legacy of a man who saw a child of former enemies and chose family. And my legacy, a boy who learned to build bridges between worlds. Complications are where interesting things happen. You are living proof that human connection is infinitely more powerful than historical enmity. I was an orphan who became a son. A German who became an American. A stranger who became family. Honor that belief. Pass it forward." The story of Michael and Klaus is just a tiny fragment in the vast, overwhelming scope of history. But it is a story that refuses to be ignored. It proves that when the smoke clears and the bombs stop falling, humanity always has a choice. We can choose to nurture the hatred that destroyed us, or we can look into the eyes of a terrified child and choose compassion. Somewhere in the quiet hills of San Francisco, 2 headstones sit side by side. Michael Chun, 1913 to 1988. Klaus Chun, 1938 to 2015. Father and son. Not bound by a single drop of shared blood, but bound by the most powerful, defiant force on earth, the courageous choice to love.